The morning had started like any other Tuesday in the Wilson household. Jennifer Wilson stood in her kitchen, nursing her third cup of coffee, watching through the window as her daughter, 3-year-old Emma, played in the backyard. The sun painted golden streaks across the manicured lawn of their suburban home in Westbrook, Ohio. It was a neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen: tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and the kind of quiet that spoke of safety and normalcy. Jennifer had made the decision to take a mental health day from her job as a nurse at the local hospital. She was exhausted, burned out, and desperately needed time with her daughter. By noon, Emma was restless and cranky. Her pigtails bounced as she ran around the backyard, chasing butterflies and picking dandelions. "Come on, baby girl," Jennifer called. "It's time for your nap. Then we can bake cookies together." Emma's face brightened at the promise of their afternoon ritual. She followed her mother inside, clutching a handful of wilted flowers. After lunch, chicken nuggets and apple slices, Jennifer carried her drowsy daughter upstairs to the small bedroom decorated with pastel wallpaper and stuffed animals. She laid Emma down in her white crib, covered her with her favorite blanket featuring cartoon princesses, and kissed her forehead. "Sleep tight, sweetheart," Jennifer whispered, pulling the door partially closed. The time was 1:15 p.m. Jennifer descended the stairs and settled onto the living room couch with her phone, scrolling through social media and sipping cold water. Around 1:45 p.m., she heard nothing unusual, no sounds of distress, no crying, nothing that would have triggered a mother's alarm. She decided to check on Emma, a habit she'd developed since becoming a parent. The monitoring was probably unnecessary for a sleeping child, but parents are creatures of worry. When Jennifer opened the bedroom door at 2:30 p.m., her heart stopped. The crib was empty. The blanket lay rumpled on the mattress. The room was exactly as she'd left it except for one crucial detail. The window, which she always kept locked, was now open. A warm breeze moved the sheer curtains. Jennifer's scream tore through the house, a sound of pure primal terror that would echo in the neighborhood for weeks to come. She ran through the rooms, checking closets, under beds, in the bathroom, everywhere a child could possibly hide. Emma was nowhere. With shaking hands, Jennifer dialed 911. Detective Sarah received the call at 3:15 p.m. that Tuesday afternoon. She was a 22-year veteran of the Westbrook Police Department, and she knew in her gut that this call was different. Missing children cases were rare in this town, and they affected everyone differently. When she arrived at the Wilson house 20 minutes later, the scene was already controlled chaos. 2 patrol cars were parked outside. Officer Martinez was taking a statement from a visibly shattered Jennifer Wilson, who sat on her front porch, her face blank with shock, her body trembling uncontrollably. Detective was a woman in her late 50s with gray streaking through her dark hair, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. She had handled 17 missing children cases over her career. She had found 12 of them alive. The other 5 haunted her still. "What do we know?" asked Officer Martinez, pulling out her worn leather notebook. 3-year-old Emma Wilson, last seen by her mother at 1:15 p.m. when she was put down for her nap. The mother checked on her at 2:30 p.m. and found the window open and the child gone. Bedroom is on the 2nd floor. No exterior ladder visible, but there's a sturdy oak tree nearby with branches that could provide access. His mind was already working through possibilities and probabilities. She walked around the back of the house, studying the landscape with the eye of someone who had done this 100 times before. The oak tree's branches did indeed come close to the bedroom window. An adult could climb them, possibly. The ground below was soft from recent rain, perfect for potential footprints, but she saw only one clear impression near the tree trunk. She photographed it with her phone and made a mental note to get forensics out here immediately. By evening, Jennifer's ex-partner had been identified as a person of interest, was a volatile man in his early 40s with a history of domestic violence and controlling behavior. He and Jennifer had ended their relationship 2 years prior, but had never fully accepted it. Neighbors reported seeing his dark blue sedan in the neighborhood several times over the past few weeks, circling the block slowly. He'd called Jennifer dozens of times, left increasingly aggressive voicemails. Jennifer had obtained a restraining order 6 months ago after had shown up at her workplace and made threats. When officers went to his apartment, he everything with a sneering confidence that made skin crawl. "I don't know what you're talking about," he'd said, sprawled on his couch as if they'd interrupted his afternoon television program. "I haven't been near that woman or her kid." But his phone records told a different story. On the day Emma disappeared, his cell phone had pinged towers near the Wilson neighborhood. When confronted with this information, he shrugged. "I drive through that area sometimes. It's on the way to the gym." Without more concrete evidence, they couldn't hold him. Walked free, and that failure burned in his chest like acid. Days turned into weeks. The investigation expanded rapidly. Search teams combed through forests, dragged ponds, and knocked on doors in an expanding radius from the Wilson home. Volunteers from the community joined the effort, their faces etched with the same fear that had gripped Jennifer. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees throughout the neighborhood. Emma's photograph was plastered on every utility pole, every storefront window, every social media page within 100 miles. The waiting was suffocating. Jennifer barely slept. She sat on her porch at dawn, staring at nothing, her coffee growing cold beside her. She'd call Detective twice a day, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Have you found anything? Please, Detective, anything." His heart broke for her each time. She had no good news to give. Then 6 weeks after Emma's disappearance, something shifted. A hiker named Tom Bradley reported finding a small red sneaker near an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The cabin belonged to a family that vacationed there rarely. It was the kind of place that could go unnoticed for months, hidden among dense trees and overgrown brush. When forensic teams arrived, they found more than just a shoe. They found evidence of recent habitation, food wrappers, a blanket, traces of DNA. And then they found Emma. The child was discovered wrapped in that blanket, dehydrated and terrified but alive. Physically, she appeared unharmed, though the psychological trauma was written across her small face. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't make eye contact. She clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest and trembled at loud noises. As emergency medical technicians worked to stabilize Emma, detectives stood in that cabin, looking at the evidence of her captivity, and her jaw tightened with righteous fury. This was what she needed. This was what would build a case. This was the beginning of justice. The call came through at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, exactly 43 days after Emma Wilson disappeared. Detective was already at her desk, her fifth cup of coffee growing cold beside a stack of case files that had become her obsession. She hadn't slept properly in 6 weeks. Her husband had stopped asking when she'd be home. Her teenage daughter had learned not to expect her at family dinners. When you work a missing child case, especially one that doesn't resolve quickly, everything else in your life becomes secondary. The caller was Tom Bradley, a 58-year-old hiker and retired accountant who spent his mornings exploring the trails that crisscrossed the dense forest surrounding Westbrook. He sounded out of breath, his voice shaking with the kind of urgency that immediately pulled his attention into sharp focus. "I found something," Bradley said. "I think I found something that belongs to the little girl, the one from the news, Emma Wilson." Was in her car within 8 minutes, lights flashing, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. She'd learned long ago not to get her hopes too high in missing children cases. False leads were common, but something in Bradley's voice suggested this was different. When she arrived at the coordinates Bradley had given her, the sun was climbing higher in the sky, burning off the morning mist that clung to the forest floor. Tom Bradley was waiting at the edge of a barely visible trail, a hiking boot on his foot and concern etched across his weathered face. He led deeper into the woods, past tangles of underbrush and over rocky terrain that seemed to grow more remote with each step. "I come out here most mornings," Bradley explained as they walked. "It clears my head, you know, but I usually stick to the main trails. This morning I decided to explore something I'd never seen before, an old cabin about 2 miles off the beaten path. Probably belonged to someone decades ago. It's completely overgrown, falling apart." They emerged into a small clearing, and there it stood, the cabin. It was a weathered structure of rotting wood and missing shingles, the kind of place that seemed to be slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Vines crawled up its walls. The windows were dark, like empty eye sockets staring out at nothing. "I looked through the window," Bradley continued, "and that's when I saw it. A small red shoe on the floor inside. At first I thought it was just trash, but then I remembered seeing Emma's picture, that little girl. I remembered she was wearing red shoes in one of the photos." His hands clenched. "Did you go inside?" "No, ma'am. I thought I should call the police first. Seemed like the right thing to do." "You did exactly right," said, already pulling out her phone to call for backup and forensic teams. While waiting for the teams to arrive, peered through a gap in the cabin's boarded window. Even in the dim light she could see it, a child's red sneaker with white trim lying on the dusty floor. Her stomach twisted. This was either going to be the break they desperately needed, or it would be another devastating heartbreak. The forensic team arrived 40 minutes later, led by Chief Analyst Doctor, a woman whose meticulous attention to detail had solved countless cases. They suited up in protective gear and entered the cabin carefully, treating it as a potential crime scene, which it absolutely was. Inside, the discoveries came quickly. Besides the shoe, they found food wrappers scattered on the floor, Cheerios boxes, applesauce packets, evidence of a child being fed. There was a blanket, a faded Disney princess blanket that matched the description Jennifer Wilson had provided of what Emma had been carrying when she disappeared. There were fingerprints on the food containers, traces of biological material that could be tested for DNA. And then, in the corner of the cabin, partially hidden behind a stack of old lumber, they found something that made doctors' breath catch. The shoe. But more importantly, they found the cabin's guest book, a log kept by the vacation property owner for visitors to sign. Signature appeared 3 times in the past year. The dates were circled in pen. One of them was dated 4 days before Emma disappeared. Back at the police station, the evidence was processed with urgency. Jennifer Wilson was called to the forensic lab. With tears streaming down her face, she identified the red sneaker as Emma's. She pointed to the specific scuff mark on the toe where Emma had dragged her foot while learning to walk. She identified the Disney princess blanket as the exact one she'd placed over her daughter that afternoon. The DNA analysis came back 72 hours later. The trace DNA found on the inner sole of the shoe matched his genetic profile with 99.8% certainty. Was arrested at his apartment on a Saturday afternoon. He was watching television when officers arrived. The same casual indifference he'd shown during the initial investigation still painted across his face. But when detective placed the DNA evidence in front of him, she saw something crack. For just a moment, fury and fear flickered across his expression before he controlled it. "I want a lawyer," he said immediately, his voice flat and cold. But the evidence was stacking up against him like dominoes. His phone records placed him near the cabin. His DNA was on the shoe. His signature was in the cabin's guest book. His truck had been seen on the road leading to the property. Yet despite all of it, maintained his innocence with the kind of stubborn defiance that only the truly guilty possessed. His expensive defense attorney, a man named Gregory with a reputation for finding loopholes, immediately began poking holes in the prosecution's case. "The shoe could have been planted," argued. "My client's DNA on an object proves nothing without context. He admits to visiting the cabin. He owns some property near there. Perfectly innocent explanation. These circumstantial pieces don't add up to a legal case. The prosecution knew was right. DNA evidence alone, without direct testimony or an admission of guilt, might not be enough. They needed the victim's identification. They needed Emma's voice, even if it came in forms that were unconventional. But first, there was one more piece of the puzzle that changed everything. 48 hours after the cabin was discovered, search teams working under the direction of Detective intensified their search of the property's surrounding forest. They found a makeshift path, deliberately obscured, leading deeper into the woods from the cabin's back entrance. The path was marked with small rocks placed in deliberate patterns, the kind of breadcrumb trail someone uses when they've traveled a route multiple times. Following that trail at dusk on a Saturday evening, Officer James and his police dog Duke discovered something that would alter the entire trajectory of the case. A small, haired child huddled beneath a fallen tree trunk, wrapped in a blanket, 3-year-old Emma Wilson alive. She was dehydrated and malnourished. She showed signs of trauma that would require immediate medical attention and long-term psychological care. She didn't speak. She barely moved, but she was alive. As the emergency medical team worked to stabilize Emma, as her mother rushed to the hospital, as the news spread through Westbrook like wildfire, Detective stood in that forest and felt something shift inside her chest. Justice wasn't a guarantee in this profession, but sometimes, if you worked hard enough and believed fiercely enough, it came anyway. And sometimes it came just in time. Ada Michael Torres sat in his office at the Westbrook County District Attorney's office, surrounded by case files, photographs of evidence, and legal briefs that represented 6 weeks of meticulous preparation. He was a 46-year-old prosecutor with a reputation for winning difficult cases, but this one was keeping him awake at night in ways that only seemed to intensify as trial date approached. The evidence against was strong: DNA, phone records, cabin access, the guest book signature. But it was all circumstantial in the way that made defense attorneys smile with predatory confidence. Gregory's attorney had already filed 4 motions to suppress evidence. He'd already argued that the DNA could have been transferred innocuously, that the phone records were unreliable, that circumstantial evidence was exactly what worried juries. Torres knew the statistics. Juries wanted certainty. They wanted to hear from witnesses. They wanted direct testimony that left no room for doubt. And the one witness who could provide absolute certainty, 3-year-old Emma Wilson, was too traumatized to take the stand in a traditional courtroom setting. Torres had tried. He'd met with Emma 3 times in the weeks following her discovery. Each time, the child had responded with complete shutdown. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't maintain eye contact. When Torres showed her pictures she'd simply turned away, her body language screaming that she wanted nothing to do with this process. Child psychologists had explained that this was common in young trauma victims, especially in cases involving prolonged captivity. "You can't force it," Dr. Lisa Reeves, the child psychologist assigned to Emma's case, had told Torres gently. "Her mind is protecting itself. Pushing her now could cause additional psychological damage that could set back her healing for years." Torres had wanted to punch something. Justice shouldn't be so complicated, but he knew it was. He knew that the law, for all its pursuit of truth, sometimes seemed designed to thwart it. Then came the conversation that would change everything. Torres had called Dr. Reeves into his office on a Tuesday afternoon, about a week after trial proceedings had begun. The trial was already into its 2nd week, and while the prosecution's case was solid, Torres could see the doubt in jurors' eyes. They were waiting for the smoking gun. They were waiting for the victim. "There has to be a way," Torres said, packing his office like a caged animal. "There has to be something we're missing. Emma knows who did this to her. She knows what happened. How do we get that truth in front of a jury without destroying her in the process?" Dr. Reeves sat across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. She was a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and the gentle demeanor of someone who had spent her career helping children process unspeakable trauma. She'd worked with Emma for 3 weeks now, and the progress was slow but measurable. "She's bonded with Officer's police dog," Reeves said carefully. "Duke. The dog was part of her rescue. In Emma's mind, that dog represents safety, protection, someone who came when she needed help most. It's the only thing that seems to pierce through her trauma response consistently." Torres stopped packing. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when Duke is present, Emma becomes more present. Her anxiety decreases. She becomes capable of communication and connection. The dog has become associated with safety and rescue in her traumatized mind. It's a form of attachment that's actually helping her healing process significantly." Torres felt something shift in his chest. An idea was forming, dangerous and unconventional but potentially brilliant. What if we brought Emma into the courtroom with the dog, not to testify in the traditional sense, but simply to make an identification, not through words necessarily, but through her actions? Dr. Reeves's eyes widened. She understood immediately what he was suggesting, and she also understood the risks. That's never been done successfully in a case like this. There are ethical questions about what constitutes admissible testimony from a 3-year-old trauma victim. There's the risk that any identification could be contested as unreliable or coached. "But it's not testimony," Torres argued, his mind working through the legal framework rapidly. "It's a simple identification. She points, she identifies. The dog is there for emotional support. We're not asking her to speak about what happened. We're not cross-examining her. We're not traumatizing her further. We're simply asking her to do what children naturally do, show us who scared her." "The defense will fight it viciously," Reeves warned. "Of course they will," Torres said. "But Judge is reasonable. She's fair. She understands child psychology. If we present this correctly, if we emphasize the exceptional circumstances and the presence of trained professionals, she might allow it." Over the next 3 days, Torres and Dr. Reeves worked on a motion to present Emma in the courtroom under controlled circumstances. They consulted with child trauma specialists. They researched precedent. They built a legal framework that was unconventional but defensible. The motion, when filed, triggered the exact response Torres had expected. Gregory erupted. He filed 3 counter-motions objecting on the grounds that it was potentially traumatizing, that it was prejudicial, that it was essentially using a child as a prop to influence jurors' emotions. He was right, in a way. It would influence jurors' emotions. Seeing a traumatized 3-year-old victim would absolutely affect how they viewed the evidence. That was exactly the point. Judge scheduled a hearing on the motion for a Friday afternoon, just before the trial was scheduled to resume Monday morning. Torres presented his case carefully, emphasizing that this was not testimony, that Emma would not be questioned or cross-examined, that trained professionals would be present, and that the child's would be the paramount concern. Stood and argued passionately that this was an attempt to circumvent proper legal procedures, that it was emotionally manipulative, that it violated every principle of fair trial practice. His arguments were actually quite good. Torres had to grudgingly admit that if he were sitting in shoes, he'd be making the same objections. But then Judge spoke, and her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen a lot in her 30 years on the bench. "This is an extraordinary case with extraordinary circumstances," said, her eyes moving between both attorneys. "A 3-year-old child has been kidnapped, held in captivity, and subjected to trauma that we cannot fully comprehend. She is the only living witness to events that a jury must evaluate. The prosecution is not asking her to testify in the traditional sense. They are asking for a simple identification, with trained professionals present in a controlled environment. While I understand Mr.'s concerns, I believe that in the interests of justice and of protecting this child's, this motion has merit." She paused and Torres held his breath. "Motion is granted," Judge continued, "but I am placing strict conditions on this proceeding. Emma Wilson will be present in the courtroom on Monday morning. She will be there for the purposes of identification only. There will be no questions asked of her. There will be no testimony solicited. A child psychologist will be present. Officer and the police dog will be present. If at any point I determine that the child is becoming distressed, this proceeding will immediately cease. Is that understood? Both attorneys nodded. Those expressions suggested he'd swallowed something bitter. That night, Torres went home and poured himself a whiskey. He sat on his apartment balcony, looking out at the city lights, thinking about Emma Wilson, thinking about the risk, thinking about justice and trauma and the sometimes impossible task of protecting a child while pursuing truth. Monday morning was going to be unlike anything this courtroom had ever seen. To be continued. Emma Wilson didn't sleep the night before, neither did her mother, Jennifer. They sat together on the small bed in Emma's bedroom, the same bedroom where the child had been taken from, the same room where nightmares came every single night. Emma wore a soft pink dress that Jennifer had carefully selected, something that would make the child feel special and safe. Jennifer had washed and brushed Emma's hair, creating neat pigtails that made her daughter look even smaller and more vulnerable than usual. "Tomorrow we're going to see a very important room with lots of people," Jennifer whispered, holding Emma close. "And Duke is going to be there. Remember Duke, the good dog who helped find you." Emma's blue eyes, so old in a 3-year-old's face, so haunted by things she was too young to understand, focused on her mother's face. She didn't speak. Emma still wasn't speaking much, though Dr. Reeves said the words would come back eventually. Instead, she simply nodded and hugged her mother. Jennifer felt tears slide down her cheeks. She was terrified, not for herself but for her daughter. Emma had been through so much already. The thought of putting her in a courtroom, surrounded by strangers in front of the man who had taken her, it was almost unbearable. But she also understood that this was necessary. This was how they would make sure he never hurt another child. "You're so brave, baby girl," Jennifer whispered. "So very brave." At 6:30 a.m. on Monday morning, Detective Sarah sat in her car outside the Westbrook County Courthouse, nursing her 7th cup of coffee. She had been awake since 4 a.m., her mind replaying every possible scenario. She'd worked with Dr. Reeves extensively on what to expect. They discussed contingency plans. They talked about what they would do if Emma shut down completely, if she became too distressed, if the entire unconventional strategy fell apart in real time. Knew the risks. She also knew that sometimes justice required taking risks. By 8 a.m., media trucks were lined up outside the courthouse like vultures circling prey. News helicopters hovered overhead. The Wilson case had captured the public imagination. A missing child, a dramatic rescue, an unprecedented legal strategy. The story was everywhere. Torres had been careful not to leak details, but somehow the media had learned that something unusual would happen in court this morning. Officer James arrived at the courthouse at 7:45 a.m. with Duke. The German Shepherd was calm and professional, trained to stay composed in chaotic environments, had worked with Duke for 8 years, and the dog responded to his handler with perfect trust. As they made their way through the basement entrance to avoid the media frenzy, Duke's ears perked up, sensing the tension and unusual energy in the building. "Easy boy," whispered, running his hand along Duke's neck. "Big day today." Inside the courthouse, Judge sat in her chambers, reviewing the motions one final time. She'd been a judge for 30 years, and she'd never done anything quite like this. She understood the legal implications. She understood the psychological implications. She understood that her decision this morning could be precedent-setting, could be appealed, could be criticized by legal scholars for decades. But she also understood that sometimes the law had to bend slightly to serve justice. At 8:30 a.m., Ada Michael Torres stood in his temporary office at the courthouse, reviewing his notes one more time. He'd barely slept, his mind cycling through every possible objection might raise, every way this could go wrong. But he'd also visualized it going right. He'd imagined the moment when Emma pointed at. He'd imagined the jury seeing that moment. He'd imagined that being the turning point they needed. Gregory arrived at the courthouse at 8:45 a.m., flanked by two junior attorneys. He was confident, almost cocky. He'd filed every objection he could think of. He'd made his record clear. He believed this was an abuse of proper courtroom procedure. Now he would sit back and watch it unfold, ready to pounce on any error, any misstep, anything that could later be appealed. At 9:00 a.m. exactly, Jennifer Wilson arrived at the courthouse with Emma. Dr. Lisa Reeves met them at a secure entrance, away from the cameras and reporters. Emma looked impossibly small in her pink dress, clutching her mother's hand with the grip of a child who was terrified of being separated again. "You're doing wonderfully," Dr. Reeves said gently, kneeling down to Emma's level. "Remember what we talked about Duke?" Emma nodded slightly. "Duke is waiting for you inside. He's a very good boy and he's going to help make sure you're safe today. All you have to do is be yourself, okay? Just be yourself." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The gallery was packed. Reporters, victims' advocates, law students who had been allowed to observe this unprecedented proceeding, curious citizens. Judge sat in her elevated seat, her expression grave and serious. She'd already warned everyone about courtroom decorum. Any disruptions and the proceedings would cease immediately. Sat at the defense table, handcuffed to a chair as was standard. His expression was unreadable, but Torres noticed the slight tension in his jaw. Knew something unusual was about to happen. He'd read the motions. He'd heard the rumors circulating through the jail about Emma being brought to court. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Torres saw a flicker of genuine concern cross face. At 9:15 a.m., Judge entered from her chambers. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The courtroom erupted into motion. Journalists leaned forward. Jurors straightened in their seats. Even the court reporter seemed to sense that this was an extraordinary moment. "We are here this morning for a proceeding that is highly unusual and unprecedented in this courtroom," Judge announced, her voice carrying through the silent room. "We have a young child present for purposes of identification only. I want to emphasize to everyone in this courtroom that the of this child is my paramount concern. Any disruption, any attempt to intimidate or upset this child, will result in immediate contempt charges and removal from this courtroom. Do we understand each other?" Her gaze swept the room, and every person present understood they were serious. "Now," Judge said, "we will proceed with the identification procedure. Bailiff, you may bring in the child and the service animal." The courtroom doors opened. Officer James walked in first, Duke moving steadily at his side. Behind them came Dr. Reeves, and then Jennifer Wilson, holding Emma's small hand. The gallery gasped. There was an audible intake of breath as people saw the tiny girl in the pink dress, so fragile she looked like she might break. Several jurors' eyes filled with tears immediately. Emma looked around the enormous courtroom, her small face overwhelmed by the scale and strangeness of it all. Then she saw Duke. Her entire body seemed to relax slightly. She squeezed her mother's hand and pointed at the dog, the first clear gesture of recognition and comfort she'd made in this place of strangers and legal proceedings. Judge leaned down from her elevated seat, her voice gentle but audible to all. "Hello, Emma. Welcome. Duke is here with you today. You're safe. Everyone in this room is here because they care about you and want to help. Do you understand?" Emma's eyes went to her mother's face, seeking confirmation. Jennifer nodded and managed a small smile despite the tears streaming down her face. "Now," Judge continued, "we're going to ask you to do something very simple. We're going to ask you to point at the person who scared you. Can you do that?" The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Emma's small hand reached out, trembling slightly. And she pointed directly at. The moment Emma entered the courtroom, everything changed. What had been an ordinary trial proceeding transformed into something far more delicate, far more consequential. Officer James led Duke carefully to the center of the courtroom, positioning the German Shepherd exactly as they had practiced. The dog was trained to remain calm and focused regardless of external stimuli. But even Duke seemed to sense the weight of this moment, his intelligent brown eyes alert, his posture attentive. Judge watched from her elevated seat, her hands folded in front of her expression grave. Every juror leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the small child now standing in the center of their universe. The gallery was absolutely silent, the kind of silence that only occurs when a room full of people holds their collective breath. Reporters gripped their notebooks. Spectators who had come expecting controversy now found themselves confronted with the stark reality of a traumatized 3-year-old child in an adult courtroom. Emma's eyes fixed on Duke immediately. The dog had become more real to her than anything else in this place. In her trauma-scrambled mind, Duke represented the moment everything changed. The moment the bad man stopped having power over her, the moment rescue arrived. The dog had been there when she was found in that forest. The dog had not hurt her. The dog had stayed calm and safe while the adults around her moved with urgent purpose. Jennifer Wilson knelt beside her daughter, her own hands trembling so badly she had to press them together to maintain any semblance of control. She was acutely aware of every camera in that gallery, every eye watching her maternal performance. But this wasn't performance. This was a mother trying to hold it together while her traumatized child stood in front of the man who had destroyed their lives. "Look at Duke, baby," Jennifer whispered, her voice carefully steady despite the tears that threatened to overflow. "See how he's so calm. He's here to help you. He's a good boy, isn't he?" Emma nodded slightly, her small body still trembling but her eyes now locked on the dog. Dr. Lisa Reeves stood nearby, ready to intervene if Emma showed signs of severe distress. She carried a packet of tissues and had already identified the location of the nearest exit should they need to remove Emma immediately. Ada Michael Torres approached slowly, his movements deliberately calm and non-threatening. He'd practiced this exact walk 100 times in his office. He'd visualized every movement, every gesture. Psychology mattered in moments like this. Abrupt movements or loud voices could spook Emma back into her trauma shell. "Hello, Emma," he said softly, kneeling down to her eye level but maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm Michael. I'm here to help you. I see you're looking at Duke. He's a very good dog, isn't he?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but her body language shifted slightly. Not quite relaxation, but perhaps the smallest degree of acceptance of this stranger's presence. "Emma," Torres continued, his voice barely above a conversational tone, "I want you to know that you're very safe here. This room might look big and scary, but everyone here cares about you. Your mom is right here. Dr. Reeves is right here. And Duke is right here. You're not alone." He paused, allowing his words to settle, watching Emma's face for any signs of distress. Her lip quivered slightly, but she held together. At the defense table, Gregory watched this entire exchange with barely concealed contempt. This was emotional manipulation at its finest, he thought. This was exactly what he'd warned Judge about, turning a courtroom into a theater of tears and sympathy, abandoning legal procedure in favor of emotional appeal. He'd already made a mental note of every procedural violation he could argue on appeal. But even couldn't deny the effect this was having on the jurors. He could see it in their faces. They had just spent 2 weeks hearing forensic testimony, DNA analysis, phone records, and technical evidence. They had remained professionally detached. But now, confronted with the physical reality of a traumatized 3-year-old child, their detachment was crumbling. Sat motionless at the defense table, but Torres noticed the transformation that had occurred in the defendant. His confident smirk was gone. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles stood out like cords. His hands, shackled to the table, had become white-knuckled fists. He couldn't look at Emma. More telling, he wouldn't look at Emma. Judge made a small gesture to Torres, a barely perceptible nod that indicated he should proceed. She was monitoring everything, Emma's emotional state, Tor's conduct, the courtroom's emotional temperature. She had the power to shut this down at any moment if she believed Emma was being harmed. So far, she was allowing it to continue. Officer stood motionless beside Duke, his hand resting lightly on the dog's neck. Had worked with Duke for 8 years, and he had never been more grateful for his training, for the dog's almost supernatural calm. Duke remained perfectly positioned, neither reacting to the emotional intensity of the moment nor seeming indifferent to Emma's presence. It was a balance that only came from years of professional training. Tors now stood and gestured toward the area where sat. He did this slowly, giving Emma time to process what was happening, giving her the opportunity to change her mind, to shut down, to refuse. This wasn't about forcing anything. This was about creating space for Emma's truth to emerge. "Emma," Tors said gently, "I want you to look around this room. I want you to look at all the people here. Can you do that?" Emma's eyes began to move slowly, scanning the courtroom. Her gaze passed over the jury box, over the gallery, over the judge's bench. She saw so many faces, so many eyes watching her. "Emma," Tors continued, "there's a man here in this room, the man you knew before, the man who took you away from your mommy, the man who brought you to that place in the forest. Do you remember him?" Emma's body went rigid. Her grip on her mother's hand tightened so intensely that Jennifer had to work to continue breathing normally. This was it. This was the moment. "Emma, when you're ready, I want you to look toward where the lawyers are sitting. There's a man at that table, the man who was with you in the forest, the bad man. Can you look at him? Can you show me who he is?" The courtroom was so quiet that you could hear the subtle shift of the judge's robes, the barely audible scrape of a juror's shoe against the floor. Every single person in that space understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that might never happen again in exactly this way. Dr. Reeves moved slightly closer, ready to intervene if Emma collapsed under the emotional weight of what she was being asked to do. Jennifer held her breath, her hand never leaving her daughter's back. Tors waited, his professional composure never slipping, though inside his heart was pounding so hard he could barely think. Emma stood there, a 3-year-old girl in a pink dress in the middle of a Westbrook County courtroom, holding the weight of justice in her small, trembling hands. And then slowly, she turned to face the defense table. Emma's small body turned with agonizing slowness. Every eye in the courtroom tracked her movement. The gallery held its collective breath. Judge leaned forward slightly on her bench, her hand instinctively moving toward the gavel, ready to halt proceedings if necessary. Dr. Reeves moved one step closer, her professional composure maintained, but her eyes tracking every micro-expression on Emma's face for signs of complete psychological shutdown. As Emma turned, seemed to realize what was happening, his body went rigid. The blood drained from his face, leaving him ashen and hollow-eyed. For the first time since his arrest 6 weeks ago, the mask of defiance and indifference completely shattered. Emma's arm rose slowly, mechanically, as though she was moving through water, each motion requiring enormous effort. Her tiny finger extended, pointing directly at. The movement was tentative at first, then gradually became more certain. She was pointing at the man who had stolen her from her mother, the man who had kept her in that dark cabin, the man whose face haunted her dreams and would likely haunt her for years to come. Ada Tors felt his heart stop and restart in quick succession. This was it. This was the moment, but he said nothing. He simply waited, letting Emma's actions speak. Then Emma's lips moved. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, fragile as tissue paper, thin as breath, but absolutely clear to every person in that courtroom. The years of training to project clearly, combined with the profound silence that Emma's presence had created, allowed her 2 words to carry the weight of absolute truth. "Bad man," she said, her voice trembling but definitive. Then she added, her eyes finding Duke, seeking reassurance, seeking safety. "Duke." 2 words. Just 2 simple words, spoken by a 3-year-old child who had been through unimaginable trauma. But those 2 words seemed to shatter something fundamental in the courtroom's atmosphere. The gallery erupted. Gasps turned into sobbing. A woman in the 3rd row was openly weeping. A man in the back pressed his hand over his mouth. Journalists scribbled frantically in their notebooks, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would define this case, would define Emma's story, would define justice itself. Several jurors were crying openly. Juror number 3, a woman in her 60s who had maintained professional detachment throughout the entire trial, now had tears streaming down her face. Juror number 7, a man who had seemed skeptical of the prosecution's case, was visibly shaking. They weren't crying because they'd been manipulated or emotionally swayed by theater. They were crying because they had just heard the truth spoken by the smallest, most vulnerable voice in the room. Judge banged her gavel once, sharp and authoritative, but not with anger. It was a gavel strike that restored order while simultaneously acknowledging the profound legitimacy of what had just occurred. "Order, I will have order in this courtroom," she announced, though her own voice carried notes of emotion that she couldn't quite suppress. Gregory stood up, his face flushed with anger and something that looked uncomfortably like desperation. "Objection! Your Honor, I object strenuously to this entire proceeding. The child has not been cross-examined. Her statement is hearsay. This is exactly the kind of prejudicial emotional manipulation that—" "Mr. Judge," interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, "sit down. You will have your opportunity to make your record, but I will not tolerate further disruptions during this proceeding." Sat down hard, his jaw working as he tried to process what had just happened. He knew, in that moment, that something fundamental had shifted. The jury was no longer neutral. The jury had just heard the victim identify the defendant. Legally, he would argue it was inadmissible, but practically, he knew that jury was going to be almost impossible to sway back toward reasonable doubt. Was gripping the table so hard his knuckles had turned completely white. His face had taken on a grayish, waxy appearance. His attorney leaned over and whispered something to him but seemed unable to focus. He was staring at Emma, and for the first time his expression contained something other than arrogance or defiance. It contained fear, raw, naked, undeniable fear. Emma, having made her identification, immediately turned back to her mother. Jennifer gathered her daughter into her arms, holding her close, her entire body shaking with sobs, cathartic, overwhelming sobs that came from the deepest part of her being. 3-year-old Emma, having summoned the courage to point at her abuser, now buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Officer gently moved Duke closer. The dog, responding to the energy shift, pressed his large head gently against Emma's small back, providing the physical comfort that a traumatized child desperately needed. It was a perfect moment of animals and humans working in concert to support a vulnerable child through an extraordinarily difficult task. Dr. Reeves moved immediately to Jennifer and Emma, her hand on Jennifer's back, her voice low and steady. "You did beautifully, both of you. Emma was so brave, so incredibly brave. We're going to get you out of here now. Okay." Judge looked at Torres and gave him a small nod. The prosecution had made his point. Continuing would only be cruel to the child who had just accomplished something extraordinary. "The child has completed the identification," Judge announced to the courtroom. "Officer, you may escort the child, her mother, and Dr. Reeves from the courtroom. The bailiff will provide a secure exit." As Officer led them toward a side door, Emma, wrapped in her mother's arms, turned her head one last time and looked at Duke. The dog's tail wagged once, that small movement seeming to communicate everything Emma needed to know. "You're safe now. You did good. You're brave." Then they were gone. The courtroom fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of people processing something that had altered them, changed them, shifted their perspective on what justice looked like. Gregory immediately stood. "Your Honor, I move to strike the child's identification as inadmissible hearsay. I move to declare a mistrial based on the prejudicial nature of this proceeding. I move. I'll hear your motions, Judge said calmly, after a 15-minute recess. Bailiff, clear the courtroom. As people began to shuffle out, Torres sat at his table, exhaling slowly. He had just witnessed a 3-year-old girl overcome her trauma enough to speak truth to power. He had watched her point at the man who had hurt her and identify him with absolute clarity. He had watched that moment shift the entire energy of the trial. But he also knew that the legal battle was far from over. Would make his motions. The defense would argue. There would be appeals and counter-arguments and legal maneuvering. But something fundamental had changed in that courtroom. Something that no legal argument could entirely undo. The jury had looked into the eyes of the victim. They had heard her voice. They had witnessed her identification of her abuser, and no amount of legal procedure or technical argument could completely erase that moment from their minds. Justice, Torres thought, sometimes came in unexpected forms. Sometimes it came from a 3-year-old girl in a pink dress, pointing her finger and speaking 2 simple words that carried the weight of absolute truth. The 15-minute recess lasted 45 minutes. Judge needed time to consider the motions that Gregory had filed. She sat in her chambers, her law clerk beside her, reviewing precedent and legal framework. She understood the stakes. This was not just about whether Emma's identification would be admissible. This was about establishing how the legal system would treat trauma victims in the future. Sat in a holding cell beneath the courthouse, no longer the arrogant, defiant man who had walked into trial 3 weeks ago. His attorney, Gregory, visited him there, trying to explain the legal landscape they now faced. The identification itself may not be admissible as testimony, explained, his voice clinical and detached. But the judge will likely rule that it provides context for the physical evidence already presented. The DNA, the phone records, the cabin access, those are all still in the record. What we have to argue is that her identification doesn't prove anything beyond the fact that a traumatized child was reacting to emotional stimuli. Said nothing. He simply stared at the concrete wall of his cell, understanding for perhaps the first time that he was truly trapped. At 2:30 p.m., the courtroom reconvened. Judge entered with a stack of documents and her expression grave. I have reviewed Mistress' motions regarding the admissibility of the child's identification, she began, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. While I understand his concerns, I am ruling as follows. The child's identification, while not traditional testimony, is admissible as a spontaneous reaction and identification. The child was not coached. The child was not asked leading questions. The child responded to a simple request to point at the person who frightened her. This constitutes a form of identification that, while unconventional, has merit in the legal record. Stood immediately. Your Honor, I must respectfully disagree with this ruling. I am nodding my objection for the record. I move for a mistrial based on the prejudicial nature of. Motion, Judge interrupted. The record will reflect your objection. Counsel, we will proceed with closing arguments tomorrow morning. This court is adjourned for the day. She banged her gavel, and the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos. That night, Ada Michael Torres sat in his office, staring at the photograph of Emma that had been entered as evidence. A 3-year-old girl, haired and blue-eyed, her face showing the weight of something no child should ever have to carry. Tomorrow, he would get one chance to convince 12 jurors that this man deserved to go to prison for 45 years. He rewrote his closing argument 4 times. The next morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of October day that seemed to match the gravity of the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with the same intensity as before. Torres dressed carefully in his best suit. He'd learned long ago that juries made judgments about credibility based on appearance as much as words. At 10 a.m. sharp, Judge called the court to order. Gregory would go first, as the defense in a criminal case presents its closing argument before the prosecution presents its rebuttal. This was opportunity to save his client. Stood with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of legal maneuvering. He was skilled, articulate, and absolutely committed to introducing reasonable doubt into jurors' minds. "Ladies and of the jury," he began, addressing the box with the practiced ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times, "I want to be clear about something. I'm not denying that a terrible crime occurred. A child was taken from her home. She was held in captivity. That is a tragedy. But the question before you is not whether a crime occurred. It clearly did. The question is whether the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that committed this crime." He walked them through the evidence point by point, suggesting alternative explanations for each piece. The shoe could have been planted. The phone records could be unreliable. The cabin access could be coincidental. The DNA could have been transferred innocuously. And the child's identification. "A child," said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "is a victim of trauma. She is confused. She is frightened. And she was placed in an emotionally charged courtroom and asked to point at a stranger. Can we really with absolute certainty say that 3-year-old Emma Wilson, traumatized beyond measure, provided an accurate identification? Or did she simply point at the man sitting at the defendant's table because he was there, because adults were watching her, because the situation was overwhelming?" It was a good argument, a compelling argument. It introduced exactly the kind of reasonable doubt that could sway a jury. Then it was Tor's turn. Ada Michael Torres stood, and for a moment he simply looked at the jurors. He made eye contact with each one. He let silence settle over the courtroom. "The defense attorney just asked you an important question," Torres said quietly. "Can we really say that Emma Wilson provided an accurate identification? And I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. Yes, we can. And here's why." He walked to a large board where evidence had been compiled. "The defense wants you to focus on reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt is important. It's a cornerstone of our legal system. But let me paint you a picture of what the evidence actually shows." Torres began methodically laying out the case. The DNA on the shoe, not just any DNA, but DNA matching with 99.8% certainty. The phone records placing near the cabin guest book with signature, the hiker who found the shoe, the forensic evidence, the timeline that fit perfectly. "But here's what matters most," Torres continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "Here's what seals this case beyond reasonable doubt: own conduct. When that traumatized 3-year-old girl pointed at him and said, 'Bad man,' how did he react?" Torres turned to the jury, his eyes intense. He went white. He gripped the table. He couldn't look at her. Why would an innocent man react that way? Why would an innocent man fear the identification of a traumatized child if he had nothing to do with her abduction? Torres moved closer to the juror's box. Emma Wilson is not confused. Emma Wilson is not making a mistake. Emma Wilson knows who took her from her mother. She knows who kept her in that dark place. She knows because she lived it. And when given the chance in the presence of the dog who saved her, she spoke that truth. Not through words coached by adults, not through leading questions, but through the simple, powerful statement, "Bad man, Duke." He paused, letting that moment linger. "The defense wants you to focus on technicalities, on alternative explanations, on the possibility of reasonable doubt. But I'm asking you to look at the totality of the evidence. The DNA, the phone records, the physical evidence, the cabin access, the timeline, the hiker's discovery, and most importantly, the identification by the victim herself." Torres returned to his seat. "That is not reasonable doubt. That is the picture of guilt, painted in unmistakable clarity. Kidnapped Emma Wilson, held her captive, and needs to pay for those crimes so that he never does this to another child again." Judge sent the jurors into deliberation at 1 p.m. The waiting began. Torres sat in the courthouse hallway, unable to work, unable to focus on anything except the tick of the wall clock. Hours passed, 3 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours. At 8:47 p.m. the bailiff appeared. "The jury has reached a verdict," he said. Tor's heart stopped. 11 hours of deliberation. That meant they'd taken it seriously. That meant they'd wrestled with the evidence. That meant they were confident in whatever decision they'd made. He gathered his materials and headed back into the courtroom. The courtroom was packed again. News of the jury's decision had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By 9:15 p.m., every seat was filled and spectators lined the walls. Jennifer Wilson sat in the front row, Emma asleep against her shoulder, the child utterly exhausted by the emotional toll of the past days. Detective Sarah sat several rows back, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but her eyes betraying the intensity of her emotions. Judge entered, her robes flowing behind her. The courtroom rose out of respect. The bailiff led the jury in, and Tor studied their faces carefully, trying to divine their verdict from their expressions. Experienced prosecutors knew that juries who had voted guilty often avoided looking at the defendant. Conversely, juries that had voted not guilty sometimes made subtle eye contact. This jury was not making eye contact with. Tors felt his heart begin to accelerate. Stood as the jury entered, his expensive suit now hanging loosely on his frame. He'd lost weight during the trial, the stress of facing conviction etched into every line of his face. His attorney, Gregory, stood beside him, his expression unreadable but his posture betraying the tension he felt. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge asked, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. The jury foreman, a woman named who worked as a high school principal, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find the defendant on the charge of kidnapping in the first degree?" Judge asked. "Guilty," said, her voice steady and clear. Jennifer Wilson's breath caught in her throat. Beside her, Emma stirred slightly but didn't wake. "How do you find the defendant on the charge of false imprisonment in the second degree?" "Guilty." "How do you find the defendant on the charge of child endangerment?" "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. It wasn't a roar of celebration. It was something more profound, a collective exhalation of relief, of vindication, of justice served. Several spectators openly wept. Reporter cameras flashed. Judge banged her gavel repeatedly until order was restored. His face had gone completely gray. His hands gripped the defense table for support. Gregory placed his hand on shoulder, but the gesture seemed more about preventing his client from physically collapsing than offering comfort. Judge polled the jury, asking each juror individually if they agreed with the verdict. All 12 answered affirmatively, their responses firm and confident. "Thank you, jury members," Judge said, her voice carrying uncharacteristic emotion. "You are dismissed from your service. Your commitment to this case, your careful consideration of the evidence, and your courage in making this decision are deeply appreciated." As the jury filed out, Tors noticed several of them looking toward Jennifer Wilson. One older gentleman made eye contact and nodded slightly, a gesture of respect for a mother who had brought her traumatized daughter to court to seek justice. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, allowing time for the preparation of victim impact statements and pre-sentence investigations. When that day arrived, the courtroom was again packed. Jennifer Wilson stood to deliver her victim impact statement, Emma holding her hand. Even though Emma wouldn't speak, her presence was powerful, a visual reminder of what this crime had cost. "Your Honor," Jennifer began, her voice shaking but determined, "I don't think I have words adequate to describe what my family has endured. The fear, the helplessness, the terror of not knowing if my daughter was alive or dead, those things changed us forever. But I also want to say this: Emma is alive. She is here. She survived because of the dedication of Detective Officer Dr. Reeves and Ada Tors. And she will continue to survive and heal because she is resilient, because she is loved, and because this court has affirmed that what happened to her matters. She looked directly at, "You took my daughter, you stole her innocence, but you did not break her. Emma is healing. Emma is speaking more every day. Emma is learning that the world is not all darkness. That is how we will move forward." Judge listened carefully to all the testimony. Then she turned to, "You have been found guilty on 3 counts of serious crimes against a child. While this court respects the jury's careful deliberation and their verdict, I must now determine an appropriate sentence that reflects both the severity of your crimes and the impact they have had on the victim and her family." She paused, reviewing her notes. "I have considered all relevant factors. I have reviewed your background, your prior criminal history, your complete lack of remorse, and the profound trauma you inflicted on Emma Wilson. I have also considered that your actions represent a fundamental violation of society's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members." Judge looked directly at, "The court sentences you to 45 years in prison on the charges of kidnapping and child endangerment, with an additional 10 years on the false imprisonment charge, to run consecutively. You will be eligible for parole consideration after serving a minimum of 35 years. You are remanded to the custody of the state." The courtroom remained silent, absorbing the finality of the sentence. Stood motionless, then turned to speak to his attorney. His expression showed no visible emotion, but his hands were trembling visibly. Outside the courthouse, as the October sun began to set, the Wilson family emerged into a barrage of camera flashes and reporter questions. Ada Torres flanked them, running interference, ensuring Emma was not subjected to direct questioning or camera focus. Officer James stood to the side with Duke, waiting for the media circus to settle slightly. When the intensity died down, Jennifer Wilson led Emma over to the dog. The child's face, which had been serious and controlled during the entire trial and sentencing, suddenly transformed. A small smile appeared, the first genuine smile anyone had seen on her face in weeks. "Can I pet Duke?" Emma asked, her voice still small but no longer trembling. "Of course you can, sweetheart," Officer said gently, kneeling beside the dog. "Duke would love that." Emma reached out and placed her small hand on Duke's head, stroking the German shepherd's fur. The dog responded by leaning gently into the child's touch, as if understanding that this small gesture of connection was profoundly healing. Photographers captured the image. A small girl in a pink dress, her hand resting on a police dog's head, her mother standing protectively behind her, the courthouse rising in the background. The image would appear in newspapers across America. It would be retweeted thousands of times. It would become symbolic of resilience, of justice, of a child choosing safety and comfort in the moment after her abuser had been sentenced to decades in prison. Over the following months, Emma began her long journey of healing. Therapy continued, but it became increasingly productive. Her vocabulary expanded. Her nightmares decreased in frequency. She began to sleep through the night. She began to laugh again, genuine, uninhibited 3-year-old laughter that made Jennifer's heart soar. A year after the trial, Emma's case became the subject of academic study. Legal scholars wrote papers about the precedent it had set regarding child identification in trauma cases. Psychology journals published articles about Emma's remarkable resilience. Child advocacy organizations pointed to her case as evidence that sometimes unconventional approaches to justice could serve both legal accuracy and the protection of vulnerable witnesses. Detective Sarah received a commendation from the police department. She framed it and hung it on her wall, but the real reward came when Jennifer Wilson brought Emma to the police station on Emma's 4th birthday. The child had specifically asked to see Officer and Duke. Emma stood in the station, her pigtails bouncing as she walked, her voice bright and clear as she greeted Duke. She was still healing, still dealing with trauma responses that would likely surface for years. But she was alive. She was speaking. She was learning to trust again. She was becoming, day by day, the healthy, whole child she was always meant to be. Emma's 2 words, bad man, Duke, changed the course of justice. They had proven that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful truths. They had established that a child's identification, given in the presence of emotional support and without coercion, could be both legally valid and psychologically protective. More importantly, they had changed how the legal system viewed traumatized child victims. Across the country, prosecutors began developing protocols based on Emma's case. Other jurisdictions began allowing similar identifications. A framework emerged for protecting children while still allowing them to participate in justice. Emma Wilson's name would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. As a child who, in her courage and vulnerability, had helped reshape how society protected its most precious citizens. On quiet evenings, Jennifer would sit with Emma, brushing her hair, and the child would talk about Duke, about how the dog had helped her feel safe, about how pointing at the bad man had made the scared feeling smaller, about how brave she had been. "You were so brave," Jennifer would say, kissing her daughter's forehead. And Emma would smile, that bright, resilient, healing smile, and say, "Duke helped." And it was true. Justice had come for Emma Wilson, not through law or procedure alone, but through the combination of dedicated professionals, unconventional strategies, and the extraordinary presence of one loyal police dog who had become, for a traumatized child, the symbol of safety itself. Sometimes justice looked like a 3-year-old girl pointing at her abuser while holding the memory of rescue in her heart. Sometimes it looked like a mother's fierce love. Sometimes it looked like a German shepherd's gentle strength. Sometimes it looked like the moment when a small voice spoke truth, and the entire world listened.